In Gaza, Israelis are fighting a ground war and an underground war against Hamas, a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Israelis also are responding to missile attacks from Hezbollah, Tehran's Lebanon-based foreign legion. These are serious conflicts, but they are not really separate conflicts. And they could be something else, something worse. Mark Dubowitz, FDD's chief executive, worries that they could be what he calls weapons of mass distraction, a way to divert the attention of Israel's military, intelligence, and political establishments, along with those of the Biden administration, from a more threatening development, the advance of Tehran's nuclear weapons program. Mark is here to tell us more about Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's nuclear ambitions and what they mean for national and international security. Also with us today, Eyal Hulata, who has served as Israel's national security advisor and head of Israel's National Security Council. He currently serves as Senior International Fellow at FDD, the first foreign visiting fellow at FDD headquarters. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're joining us, too, here on Foreign Policy. Well, gentlemen, good to see you both. Mark, start with this. I want to hear you on this, Eyal, too. Let's suppose, just imagine yourself. You're Ali Khamenei right now. You're the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic. How are you doing right now? I mean, how's the war against Israel going? How does the Middle East and the wider world look to you at this moment? Are you happy with the hand you're playing?
Cliff, thanks so much for having me on. So yes, I mean, I think if 2022 was a terrible year for Ali Khamenei, where he had hundreds of thousands of Iranians on the streets, the Women Life Freedom movement, yelling death to the dictator, I think that the past 5-6 months have been pretty good for the Supreme Leader. He has seen his proxies activated, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah, in this ring of fire that he has established around Israel. And he is working on his, I would say, dagger of fire, his atomic dagger of fire, which is the expansion of his nuclear program. So you mentioned this weapon of mass distraction that he unleashed with the Hamas invasion on October 7th. I think that's been quite useful to him because there's been no discussion of his weapon of mass destruction in the past number of months. It's sort of fallen off the front burner of the Biden administration. I would argue it's fallen off the front burner of the Israeli government that has been consumed by what's going on in Gaza and in Lebanon. And yet a recent report from the International Atomic Energy Agency makes it very clear that program continues to expand in very dangerous ways.
Yeah. I'll pick up on that a little bit. If you're Ali Khamenei, you'll be 85 next month. What do you want for your birthday? And also, if you're 85, look, he could live another 5, 10 years. He could live to be 100. Yeah. But there are things he wants to achieve while he's alive. And, before he goes and takes tea with Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, what does he want to achieve and in what time frame?
First, it's interesting whether or not he feels that he's close to it. Then these people don't die easy, right? I mean, he's been Supreme Leader for 35 years now.
Only the second Supreme Leader since the 70. Yeah,
and I'm sure that he is cognizant that these kind of authoritarian regimes, they usually have problems in the third generation. He's been holding Iran for so long and so tight without any meaningful design process of succession coming after him. And we know when we look at the scene of people surrounding the Supreme Leader at the moment, it's not there are no bright stars as it comes to popularity in Iran, to their ability to be both politically strong and also ideologically strong. None of the mullahs like he was, right? He was, I think he was a reasonable authority in theology at the time when he was appointed Supreme Leader. There is no other of those people. Some of them are critical of the regime, but I'm sure that he is indeed thinking about legacy. Right, he's thinking about what kind of Iran he wants to pass along to the next generation. Knowing their culture well, I'd assume he'd want to pass more options There is a question whether or not how wide the option list he will want to pass. He might want, to confine the ability of someone who will come after him that, by all means, he should think that they will be less capable than him. I think those are the kind of things that he's thinking about. And just to pick up of Mark said before, I think that he will summarize 2023 with a very satisfactory approach to it, which is it's specifically frustrating because I think he would have summarized 2022 as not a very good year since the Islamic Revolution. But that's the way things happened in 2023, not just since the October War, by the way. I think from the beginning of 23, at least from an Israeli perspective, this was not the main focus.
But let's get a little bit more specific for a second. Does he feel that he needs in his lifetime to have the achievement of Iran, of the Islamic Republic of Iran, having a nuclear weapon or at least a nuclear weapons capability? Or is that something he can leave to his successor and say, I paved the road? And secondarily, and this is very important, does he feel he needs to wipe Israel off the face of the earth while he's alive, or can he watch that from heaven? Because we're talking about legacies here, and I'm going to just one other aspect to all this. Putin wants his legacy to be that he restored the Russian Empire by conquering Ukraine. Xi Jinping wants his legacy to be that he brought Taiwan under the Chinese Communist Party. And the Taiwanese now consider themselves Chinese. I think we know that Ali Khamenei wants to destroy Israel. It wants genocide. It wants to erase the state from the map. Now, again, he may think, I need to do that, or he may think, hey, you know what? It'll happen, and I've made progress. That's all I need to do. I've got the ring of fire, as you say. And by the way, two other things, and I'm putting a lot on the table. One is he is in an alliance, an axis with communist China, with neo-imperialist Russia, not because they have the same ideologies, but because they have the same enemies. They both want to destroy the primacy of the United States. Russia and China, I would say, don't care much about Israel. China is more hostile to Israel than I might have expected it to be. We're seeing that through TikTok and the propaganda it has, and that's had some interesting impacts on the Hill, which FDD has played a role in. And we can talk about that too. So he's in this axis of anti-American regimes. And he's thinking, what do I need to do and how fast do I need to do it? Anyway, I put a lot on the table for you, but pick up wherever you want.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. But I think, first of all, it's worth noting that Khamenei already has a nuclear weapons capability. He has essentially an infrastructure that in a matter of days, he can produce one nuclear weapon. In a matter of a few months, he can produce up to 13 nuclear weapons.
Right, so but within 5 months, that's according to ally David Albright, yeah.
Right, so within 5 months, 13 nuclear weapons. That's in terms of the fissile material, the weapons-grade uranium. He's got the missiles to deliver it, certainly to target Israel, U.S. forces in the Middle East, and our allies throughout the Middle East and even in Europe. They haven't yet completed their ICBM program.
But they're working on that, and that's not been banned under anything that any of the negotiations ever. And FDD's Ben Talibu has been writing about the extent to which that ICBM program has been advancing all this time.
Correct, and that only has one address, which is the United States of America. So, I mean,
because it's an ICBM, you don't need an intercontinental ballistic missile to reach Israel. You already have that capability, but to reach America, you do.
Right, exactly right. So I think his ambition is to have a nuclear-tipped ICBM to threaten the United States. Because look, Khamenei's ambitions, one, are to destroy the Jewish state, as you said. Two is to expel the United States from the Middle East. Three is to become a nuclear weapons power, and not just have one nuclear bomb or two nuclear bombs, but have dozens and have a nuclear-tipped ICBM and establish the Islamic Republic as a major superpower. And that might sound ridiculous to us, Cliff, but the Islamic Republic is a major oil power. It's a major natural gas power. It's an alliance, as you said, with China and with Russia. And when it has multiple nuclear weapons and nuclear-tipped ICBMs, it becomes, by definition, a major regional power or a superpower in the region, and a major international power. So Khamenei is on his way to doing that. Now, whether he wants to actually test nuclear devices before his demise or hand that off to his successor, we don't know. I think it's actually immaterial at this point.
Does he need to test them? Is that absolutely essential?
Well, I think he needs to test them ultimately just to make sure they work and to send a message to the world. We are now a nuclear weapons power.
But I just want to emphasize this point, that when we talk about this axis, it's an axis of nuclear weapons armed powers, obviously Russia, obviously China. North Korea is also in this axis. And thanks to, I would say, correct me if you think I'm wrong, failed diplomacy on the part of Republican and Democratic administrations going back at least a generation, North Korea has nuclear weapons. North Korea has the missiles to deliver them, increasingly sophisticated. North Korea also, and this is not as well known as it should be, is very much in alliance with Iran. We believe, a lot of people believe, you can say if I'm right about this, Eyal, that the tunnels under Gaza, these 450 miles or so of extensive, elaborate, sophisticated tunnels, couldn't have been done and were probably done with engineers from North Korea. And the North Koreans also may have been helping Hezbollah develop tunnels to the extent of which we don't know. The Syrian nuclear reactor that the Israelis destroyed a number of years ago was also based on North Korean design. And, one of the things that Surveys wrote a column about this is that President Biden's giving his State of the Union last week, and he doesn't mention this axis and doesn't mention the idea of all of these being nuclear powers. I mean, this is way more dangerous than anything we faced during the Cold War. And he never mentions Iran's nuclear weapons capability at all. Actually, he has one sentence, one in the whole speech. He gives more time to potato chips and snackflation, what do you call it, than he gave to Iran in this. So this seems to me to be critical and seriously dangerous state of the world.
Look, I think, at least from an Israeli perspective, we've been experiencing the, I will say, unwillingness of the administrations in plural to deal with
American administrations.
to deal with the Iranian problem decisively. Right, the lack of willingness to use force or to project force or to threaten in the use of force. I think we've experienced that for the last, 15 years at least. That has been the case, maybe even more. And as National Security Advisor, I almost took that as a given. Okay, Israel needs to create our strategy and our contingencies, provided the fact that we'll need to deal with this problem by ourselves. If we're able to coordinate properly with an administration, be it whichever it will be, we can get support, we can get the equipment that we need. Clearly, the American toys are way more effective than the ones we have to deal with such an elaborate and deeply dug program into the mountains. But what happens if this isn't the case? What happens if an administration does not want to engage, doesn't see this as a priority, is pursuing a policy of containment, facing the fact that Iran is marching towards, and maybe Mark is right, maybe they're already considering themselves at the threshold state, right? I mean, it's all a perception. What matters is how they view themselves, not only how the world views them. And at least from an Israeli perspective, these are the cards. For us, this is the most serious, strategic, not to say potentially existential threat we have. We're past October 7. October 7 was the most devastating day we had since the Holocaust. This is not even close to being existential to Israel. The army was asleep, but when he woke up, it took them several hours and days, and we can flatten Gaza as we see fit. This is not the case if Iran goes nuclear. If Iran goes nuclear, the coverage of that umbrella will be way more limiting to Israel freedom of action. So for us, the calculus is just totally different.
But in terms of Gaza, make me more confident than I am. We say you could flatten Gaza, you could flatten Hamas within Gaza. Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, the two most important Hamas leaders, they still seem safely ensconced in their tunnels, either under Khan Yunis or Rafah, I don't know which. My impression is, tell me if I'm wrong, that the Philadelphia corridor, the border with Egypt, still has tunnels under it, which would mean that they could still be getting weapons right now, at the same time that they're getting plenty of food and fuel. Why? Because every time food and fuel comes in from Israel, we know that Hamas steals maybe, I don't know, 70% of it, something like that. Yeah. So they may be sitting, I mean, I wouldn't, I'd be a little claustrophobic down there, but they're a long way from defeated. And at the same time, you've got the so-called international community. And if I'm Ali Khamenei, I think this also brightens my day. They seem more with me than they do with the Israelis by far. The UN certainly is unsympathetic, and that's a generous term, to Israel, and not unsympathetic to Iran, no matter what the Islamic Republic does to its own people, or it does in the region, or supplies the Houthis with weapons to continue to interfere with the freedom of the seas. All of that is so. But tell me, give me your appraisal, give me yours too, Mark, of how the war is going. I know it's a distraction, but I want to hear about it.
It is,
but it is. But it's
actually, Cliff. This is my point. Actually, note this podcast. We spent maybe 10 minutes talking about Iran and its nuclear program, and now all of a sudden we're into Gaza and Khan Yunis and Rafah. But we need to talk about this because it's an important.
Let me wrap this in a few sentences and go back to talk about Iran, because I think this exactly makes the point not only on the distraction but also on legitimacy. So. Israel has been waging this war for more than 5 months now. Yeah. If anyone thought that this is an easy task to get rid of a non-state terror organization who controls a territory, who had years to create this infrastructure, then it's not. Okay, and this is not because the IDF isn't capable, it's because it's a difficult task. And it's a difficult task to do this while they're shielding themselves with civilian population, while they're keeping the civilians for entering this immense infrastructure they built underground that could have provided shelter for those civilians. Right? We don't talk about this a lot.
450 miles, you could get a lot of people.
When Israel invested all this money in defenses and shelters, it's to protect the civilians, not the soldiers. In Hamas, they keep the terrorists in the tunnels and keep the civilians up. Because it helps them exactly in what we need to get into in limiting Israel's legitimacy to conduct the war. The appetite of the liberal world, of the Western world, not only, but for Israel, that's the world that matters. I don't care that China doesn't like the number of casualties in Gaza.
They don't care about that.
But I do care when it's an issue here in the United States of America, because it is limiting Israel's legitimacy. And the unique circumstances of Israel, the unique security circumstances of Israel are not acknowledged well enough. And I think that year by year we find ourselves a need to confront larger challenges on the security front with less understanding of what that actually means. People have forgotten the times where the U.S. was also directly suffering from such issues. FDD doesn't, because it was built after 9/11, so you know exactly well what it is like to be surprised. Israel is surprised a lot, and the Western world doesn't recognize that. And I'm saying this to go back to the point of Iran. This is not an issue of capabilities. This is an issue of legitimacy. And when it comes to Iran, Israel might need to act even if the entire world does not understand why we're doing it at this point in time. When it's not aligned with the interests of the United States and their need to pivot to China or to tackle other issues. We may not have the ability to wait until the conditions are ripe to get legitimacy. That is fundamentally the problem that I understand that we had to deal with this before and will need to deal with this in the future. And the fact that all of this has become a matter of distraction, of taking the attention away from the serious problems. And on the other side, the inability to create the legitimacy to do something that is quite trivial, right? I mean, Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. President Biden said that. It appears in the Jerusalem Declaration that he gave during his visit in July of 22. The administration is saying that appeasement and containment is not their strategy. They're trying to prevent it. But what happens if they don't and Israel needs to act? Will we have the legitimacy to act militarily on Iran when the time comes? I think that's a serious question we need to deal with. And I think what Iran is capably doing through the Gaza war is not only weakening us militarily. They are weakening us in our positioning in the world. The legitimacy of Israel as a country, the legitimacy of Israel to step up and to defend itself. This is eroded over this 5 months, unfortunately. If I'm Ali Khamenei and sitting in Iran, I'm celebrating that more than I'm celebrating the number of casualties or the number of interceptors that Israel has wasted, so to speak, in this round. We'll produce more, but the legitimacy that is eroded, that's very difficult to win back.
Yeah, that's a really profound point from Khamenei's point of view. Right, he is winning because he will fight Israel to the last dead. Palestinian, Lebanese, Iraqi, Syrian, Yemeni, you name it, right? As long as he doesn't actually have to risk the lives of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so he's got a proxy strategy where he throws proxies at Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. He's pretty much shut down the Red Sea using his Yemeni proxy, the Houthis. He has attacked U.S. troops over 165, 70 times. He's killed 3 U.S. soldiers and wounded dozens more. And these are his proxies. And the Biden administration's response to the killing of Americans is to go after the proxies, not to go after the head of the snake or the head of the octopus sitting in Tehran. So it plays perfectly into Khamenei's strategy, because when the United States, especially Israel, go after the proxies, then it undermines the legitimacy of the U.S. and Israel. Because then the screens are filled with lots of dead Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and Iraqis, etc. So he wins on both accounts. He ties us down with his proxies, and then when Israel and the United States respond to those proxy attacks, then it undermines our legitimacy as Western powers to fight these enemies. So he's sitting in Tehran, really, really enjoying the past 5 months.
And I don't see.
Just to make the point on that, when I was National Security Advisor in the previous government in Israel, the strategy that we promoted was different exactly for that point, right? Prime Minister Bennett called it the octopus doctrine. Yeah. Okay, and the purpose was that instead of wasting our time and efforts on the proxies and eroding our capabilities and, to some extent eroding their capabilities, we need to get the regime in Iran on the defense. We need to have them worry about how penetrated they are, about how much we know and able to surprise them, about our ability to take out their capabilities where they feel safe, 1,000 miles away from Israel's borders. When we, Israel, was effective in that, we could see how that limited their positioning, how that limited their outreach, how that made them more kind of confined to themselves. When I talked about 2022 was a very bad year for Iran in general on a host of things. Of course, not only because of things that happened in Iran at the time. Their strategic assistance to the Russians was exposed in July of 22. That did not do good to their image. Of course, they overcome that. Who remembers that today? Nobody cares. You remember how summer 22 looked at that? They were very close to have sanctions in the Security Council. Of course, the Russians would have vetoed it, but it was debated. And then in September, the riots started after the killing of this poor young lady, Amani, in the streets of Tehran. This is how 2022 looked like. They were on the defense on all accounts and fronts. Come 2023, and they're able to expose so many of the things.
Yeah, why? But what changed is October 7th, because that.
Well, it didn't start on October 7th, Cliff. This started in the beginning of 23, when the Americans cut the deal with the Iranians on the hostages and $16 billion. I don't want to criticize that deal or not.
I would be glad to
but that was way before October 7th, was it?
Yeah.
When Iran got the ability or started exporting 2.5 million barrels a day to China, evading sanctions, that was way before October 7th, wasn't it? Yeah. It's a host of things that happened in the beginning of 23. I have criticism on the amount of pressure that the Israeli government stopped putting on the administration on it. But these policy calls were made here in Washington.
Well, and one of the most important policy calls made in Washington was not to support the hundreds of thousands of Iranians on the street. I mean, imagine a situation now where we literally have millions of proxies inside Iran. Right? Khamenei has these proxies outside of Iran, attacking the United States and Israel. We have millions of proxies inside Iran. They're called the Iranian people. The vast majority of them who despise this regime. Many of them who took to the streets in protest, women ripping off their hijabs, risking imprisonment and torture and rape and murder. And yet they took to the streets And the Biden administration, and I would say the Trump administration before that, and certainly the Obama administration before that in 2009, where even more Iranians were on the streets in the Green Revolution, we did nothing to support these people, right? And I use the word proxy in a sense of like if we were smart, we could operationalize that. But these are genuine protests from Iranians who want to bring down their regime. If we were really smart about this, we would do what Ronald Reagan did during the Cold War, which is provide significant material support at the time to anti-Soviet dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, right? To wear away the economic, moral, political legitimacy of the Soviet Union and ultimately help collapse.
You talked about the transition from the Trump administration's maximum, what was it called?
Pressure campaign.
Maximum pressure campaign to one of maximum deference. Is that the phrase you used?
Yeah, maximum deference or maximum concessions.
Concessions. But there's one other point I want to make here, and that is I was recently talking to somebody, I won't mention his name, but he teaches at Johns Hopkins. And I said something about, maximum pressure should have been maintained. That would have been. He said, well, no, it was tried and it failed. And my response was, it was tried for 2 years. That's, and had an impact. They didn't have the kind of funds they have now, when we can talk about that, to support Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, missile development program, but it should have been kept up for 4 years, 6 years. If you're going to pressure somebody, keep the pressure on. You can't just hold them for 2 years. Is not very much, really, though it had an impact. Anyway, I think...
No, Cliff, that's exactly right. Look, maximum pressure was tried for 2 years. It wasn't maximum pressure either.
And it wasn't really maximum.
It was economic pressure.
Yeah.
The only, use of American military power, and it was an important use of it, was the killing of Qasem Soleimani by President Trump. And otherwise, no support for the Iranian people, so no maximum support. And besides economic pressure, no use or credible threat of other instruments of American power. But it was for 2 years. President Trump loses. President Biden campaigns and then comes into office saying the maximum pressure campaign of my predecessor failed. I am going to return to essentially maximum diplomacy in order to go back into the 2015 nuclear deal. And to do so, we are going to incentivize the Islamic Republic to come back into the deal. And that means no enforcement of oil sanctions, access to billions of dollars of frozen oil assets, no use of American military power, no support for the Iranian people, even though they're on the streets yelling death to the dictator. Why is the United States not supporting us? We have this incredible moment where we can press the regime. And if we want to press the regime to get a new nuclear deal that's longer and stronger and broader, as President Biden and Blinken had promised, great. If we are going to press the regime in order to wear away its legitimacy and its economic potency and its military aggression, great. If we're going to wear it away, so we're going to weaken it and ultimately lead to the collapse of the Islamic Republic, great. If we're going to do all three at the same time, even better. And President Biden went the other way in a campaign of maximum deference and maximum concessions, and we've seen the result: an emboldened Islamic Republic, a nuclear program that has galloped ahead under President Biden's watch. And that's a very important point.
And this strategy to get them to go along with a longer and stronger agreement, or even a weaker and shorter agreement, failed. Ali Khamenei has shown no interest in it. He's turned it down. Nevertheless, the appeasement, the concessions have continued so that we have sanctions, but we don't enforce them. Our friends at United Against Nuclear Iran pointed out that the Biden administration refuses to support sanctions, and as a result, and you'll know the figures off the top of your head. I know you will.
Under Biden.
Yeah, the $90 billion under Biden that they are spending not to make their kindergarten the best in the world, not to have the best darn healthcare system in the Middle East. They're spending it on terrorism and again.
But I want to make one other point on the nuclear program, because I want to keep coming back to the nuclear program, because again, I don't want to get massively distracted on all these other issues, right? It's Iran's nuclear weapons program, as Eyal said, that represents the existential threat to Israel and a severe strategic threat to the United States, particularly when they get nuclear-tipped ICBMs, right? Let's point this out, and it's very important to point it out, because there was a whole debate over the JCPOA. Was it a good deal or a bad deal? FDD believed it was a deeply flawed deal. There was a whole debate about should we withdraw from the agreement, as President Trump did in May 2018. Some at FDD thought we should fix the agreement. Some thought we should nix the agreement. But at the end of the day, what happened under President Trump is that Iran incrementally expanded its program. It waited from May 2018 to May 2019. It did nothing. It then incrementally expanded its program until Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. Then it stopped expanding its program for about 11 months. It was then Biden came in, talked about maximum deference, the end of maximum pressure. And under President Biden, all of the nuclear expansionary steps that have taken place, enrichment to 20%, 60%, 84%, installation of advanced centrifuges. By the way, they're now constructing a new enrichment facility at Natanz, buried 100 meters underground, encased in concrete, which we worry may be impervious not only to Israeli bombs, but American bombs, which will essentially allow them into a zone of immunity where they can now develop this industrial-sized nuclear weapons program without our ability to respond. All of that has taken place under this administration, right? And this is not a political judgment. This is a policy judgment. This administration's Iran policy has failed, and it's failed miserably. And the administration doesn't want to mention Iran in its State of the Union, Cliff, because it has no strategy. It doesn't want to admit the strategy has failed. And by the way, after October 7th, the administration bent over backwards to disconnect the dots. Yeah. Remember, they didn't want to talk about Iran. They didn't want to talk about the centrality of Iran's role in what was going on in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the Red Sea, in Iraq and Syria, right? They are loath to admit that Iran and Khamenei himself is the directing hand of everything we see.
And if I may, Cliff, there's another point to be made here, and it has to do with I read the talkbacks to the pieces the FDD is putting out about the Iranian nuclear program status at the moment, and people ask, well, all of this would have been avoided if JCPOA was still installed. I want to make two comments on this, which I think are very important, and this is widely in agreement in Israel across all of the governments that were there. There are two fundamental issues that the JCPOA have put through that were problematic. The first thing is that it legitimized the Iranian ability or justification to have an enrichment program in the first place. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. This was never happened before in any of the countries in the region. But even more importantly, it had a time lapse. And we could ask ourselves, what would have happened if Iran was still in JCPOA? All the things that we're dealing with at the moment, the amount of 60% that they have and 20% that they have, and the tunneling, this wouldn't have happened right now. Well, maybe. We never know. But what's for sure is that come 2025, the barriers of the JCPOA, the restrictions on Iran start to be removed, and come 2031, there are no restrictions at all. I'm just trying to think about this from an Israeli perspective. I would also argue from an American perspective. That's not many years away. So Iran would have been in compliance with a deal that they took just to buy time, and then they enjoy all the legitimacy in the world because the JCPOA grants them the ability to have the nuclear enrichment capability as they see fit. And now they would have done all the things that we're experiencing now, but with no criticism from the world at all. Would that have been better for us or for the United States to deal with? We cannot look at this short-sightedly. For a change, and this is an Israeli speaking, right? We're never known to be strategic thinkers and to plan ahead into the future and all that, right? We're always conceived to look at here and now. But seriously, thinking about it, how better would that have been? This is the reality. This is what Iran actually wants. They haven't changed their ambitions. This is what they negotiated back then. This is what they will continue to pursue. And the question we need to ask is, what's the proper strategy to curb that and to be able to confine this so this doesn't materialize? This is a corner piece of an Israeli interest not to be under an existential threat. I think it's also for the Americans.
Can I note something? It's really remarkable. Eyal and I were in France last week, and amongst other things, we were talking to the French about Iran and the nuclear program. And I want to just point out something, Cliff, that may surprise you and may surprise our listeners, is that today the French, the Germans, and the British are much tougher on Iran's nuclear program than the Biden administration. So recently, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors met to consider the recent IAEA report, which talks about everything that we've mentioned on this podcast, the rapid expansion of Iran's nuclear weapons program and the grave concern that the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, has about this program. This is a UN bureaucrat who's seriously concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons program. And the French and the Germans and British wanted to table a censure resolution at the Board of Governors meeting to refer Iran's nuclear file to the Security Council in order to express their condemnation. Well, guess who blocked it? Not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the North Koreans, the Biden administration. The Biden administration actually told our European allies, no, we will not support that censure resolution because the Biden administration, at the end of the day, fundamentally does not believe that American power, or even the credible threat of American power, or even the credible threat of international censure, right, will get the Iranians to back down. They live in fear that any kind of threat, credible threat, or application of power is going to lead to escalation by the Islamic Republic.
You know, what strikes me about this, it's one thing, I don't necessarily agree, for President Biden to constantly say to the Iranians, to the Chinese, others, we don't want to see the military dimension expand. We don't want to see the conflict expand. Everybody knows he doesn't, but he keeps reassuring them. But in this case, this is not military. This is merely diplomatic. And there was Reuters had a report from a conversation with probably a French diplomat, it was off the record, saying, yeah, the Americans want to tell the Iranians that they don't want to escalate diplomatically. Diplomatically? I mean, it's one thing to say, I don't want to, we're firing at the Houthis, we're knocking down their weapons, but we don't want this to expand to a wider conflict with Iran, although, again, but to say diplomatically, that looks so weak, and that looks weak to Ali Khamenei, and it looks weak to our allies, and a resolution of condemnation that's escalating in a way that you don't want to do. Wow.
It's remarkable. So they don't want to use economic power. They don't want to use military power. They don't want to use offensive cyber power. They don't want to support the Iranian people, and they don't even want to use diplomatic power.
This is, and by the way, this comes in the context of the capitulation to the Taliban. And if I'm Xi Jinping, if I'm Vladimir Putin, I think if the Americans are going to capitulate to the Taliban, they don't have an air force, they'll capitulate to anybody. We just have to be tougher than they are. We just have to threaten and blackmail. They're going to back down. They are not a strong horse. They're a weak horse. That's what it looks like, and to our enemies, but also, I think, increasingly to our allies. But let me just push back on one thing. We can say, we don't want to be distracted. But what my point about October 7th is that after that, it's not like you can simply say, all right, never mind Gaza. We're going to focus everything on Iran. No, you have to finish Gaza. And by the way, there's this catch-22 that Biden wants you to do it quickly, but not too quickly, because, for example, we're in Ramadan right now. My guess is that Biden doesn't want you, and there's reasons for you to think we're not going to go full force attack Hamas in Gaza during Ramadan because you got problems in Judea and Samaria, renamed by the Jordanians, the West Bank, after they conquered it. I'm always going to remind people of that. And by the way, you'll also have we're recording this on March 13th. I think it was on March 12th that at least 100 rockets were launched by Hezbollah at northern Israel. So you can't just say, we're not going to worry about that either, but you got 100,000 Israelis who are displaced. No one worries about that displacement, right? They're in hotels. So you can't simply say, we're going to focus all our energies right now on Iran. Here's what we can do today to set Iran back, set back its program, because you do have an ongoing war and an almost in the south and an almost ongoing war in the north. I know I'm complicating things.
No, but Cliff, you're absolutely right, and this is exactly what happened. This is why the distraction was so successful. I must say that in this, of course, there are debates within Israel how to deal with it. The more I hear our government talking about the need to reach total victory in the war in Gaza, I'm a bit worried, because total victory in Gaza doesn't necessarily mean total security on all of the other fronts that we deal with. To have a very long war in Gaza and this is not to say that we shouldn't continue and fulfill it. Of course, we need to remove Hamas from Gaza if we ever want a new reality in Gaza, and we'll definitely need to continue to push to target also Sinwar and Def and all of the leaders of Hamas. Like I hope we're able to take Marwan Issa, as was put in the press. Of course, we need to do all of that, but the longer this takes, the longer this war continues, the more entangled we are in this issue. We're going to reach a situation where Israel's presence in Gaza might be needed for a very long period of time because, and again, I am critical on my government on these issues. We haven't developed a day-after strategy. We haven't developed the means to run the strip by civilian pragmatic forces that would allow Israel to address the attention to where we actually need it to be, and to all the other fronts that we have. So it's all very complicated. As you say, we need very delicate decision making to get out of this position. This is not the scope of this discussion, but as you can imagine, since I was National Security Advisor of a different government, I may have different views on how we should go about this at the moment and into the future.
Well, at some point we should have that discussion, actually, because it's an interesting discussion to have. Maybe it's beyond our limits and our time.
But Cliff, let me sort of give you the thought. You asked about how Ali Khamenei looks at this.
Yeah,
well, let's think about how the Mossad director thinks of this. Okay, he's sitting in Herzliya, Israel, and he has been told by the Prime Minister of Israel, "I want you to mobilize Mossad to go kill Hamas around the world, terrorists, enablers, financiers, proliferators. I want you to go after and kill all of the senior Hamas leaders as well as their enablers around the world." That makes a lot of sense, given the horrors of October 7th. But you're also sitting there as Mossad director in Herzliya, Israel, and you're thinking to yourself, the Iranians have the fissile material they need for 13 weapons. They have the missiles to deliver them. The last step in the development of a deliverable nuclear warhead is the actual warhead. And according to Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence, the Supreme Leader hasn't yet made, quote, the decision to develop a warhead. After October 7th, after 9/11, after what happened in Iraq, we should all be questioning the judgments and assessments of all our intelligence communities, especially on something as complicated to detect as the development of a warhead, which can take place in a room the size of FDD's office. But the fact of the matter is there may be only 24 or so weapons scientists inside Iran who have the capabilities to develop that warhead that then will ultimately allow Khamenei to develop this atomic nuclear infrastructure. Well, if you're head of Mossad, don't you want to kill those 24 nuclear scientists? Very complicated operation. Mossad, by the way, has been successful in the past. They actually killed the head of Iran's nuclear weaponization program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and a very brilliant and complicated Mossad operation. But wouldn't you want to devote your resources to killing the 24 nuclear scientists so Khamenei can't complete his atomic weapon, as opposed to devoting all those resources to hunting down Hamas around the world, right? Those are the kind of very difficult decisions that the Prime Minister and the Mossad director is going to have to make. I would contend, and I'm not the Mossad director or the Prime Minister of Israel for that matter, but I would contend that if I were going to allocate resources, you want to try to do as much of both as you can. But if I were going to prioritize right now, I would prioritize the weapon scientists over the Hamas terrorists and enablers. And I would say to myself, you know what? Like what happened after the massacre of Israeli athletes in the 1972 Olympics, where Mossad went after the Palestinian terrorists who had killed those athletes, that was a multi-year campaign that took a couple decades to actually complete. Right? So yeah, launch that campaign. It'll be patient. It'll be meticulous, and it'll be lethal, and go after those Hamas terrorists and enablers. But in terms of timing and priority, surely the imminence of an Iranian nuclear weapons program needs to take precedent, and the killing of those 24 nuclear weapons scientists needs to be the priority.
Because keeping the main thing is always the main thing. All right, but I can imagine somebody listening to this conversation saying, guys, listen. Israel, we know, has nuclear weapons too. So, if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, they'll know that if they use nuclear weapons, they're going to get hit back very hard. Now, I would say, and if you agree with me, you can't be confident in that. And why is that the case? because I was somebody who was in Iran in 1979. I know what the first Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, said about that, and what others like Ahmadinejad said is, yeah, we understand. So one nuclear weapon pretty much destroys Israel forever. Maybe they send a lot of nuclear weapons here and destroy a lot of Tehran and a lot of Iran. We still win because the idea of the Islamic Revolution is it's not an Iranian revolution. So the idea is that Islam wins. And I think it was Khomeini who said, if Iran has to burn, let it burn.
Well, it was actually also, you're right, but it was also the quote-unquote pragmatic, relatively moderate Rafsanjani, a former president of Iran, who's touted in Washington as being this, again, this pragmatist and moderate, who not only said that Israel's a one-bomb country, but we should be prepared to lose millions of Muslims.
That's the same ideology.
Exactly, in order to achieve that objective. So, I would say that we should be very careful in not assuming that the Islamic Republic is both genocidal and suicidal. Right? We should be careful in not assuming that, because they may be. But I think Eyal had really pointed to this before in the conversation, which I think is more important. Even if you assume that the Islamic Republic is not genocidal, either it won't use a nuclear weapon, or suicidal, is prepared to actually lose millions of Iranians and maybe tens of millions of Muslims in an Israeli nuclear retaliatory strike. The fact is, if you're an IDF planner thinking about responding to the next October 7th, God forbid, and dealing particularly with Hezbollah, right, which is Iran's closest proxy, and you've got an Iranian nuclear weapon hanging over your head, and the Iranians are going to go to, DEFCON 1 in terms of a nuclear crisis, right? By the way, we went to DEFCON 1 or DEFCON whatever after the Six-Day War and the 73 war. Imagine a U.S. president, right, facing threats by Iran to go, quote, nuclear. Where's that U.S. president going to apply his or her pressure on Israel not to escalate? So if you think Biden is a problem today in telling Israel, don't escalate against Hezbollah, don't escalate by going into Rafah, I want everybody to calm down and de-escalate because I'm worried about World War III. Imagine a scenario where the Islamic Republic has nuclear weapons, are threatening the introduction of nuclear weapons, and a U.S. president says to Israel, we're about to risk nuclear catastrophe, back down. So what it's going to do is severely constrain the ability of Israel, and particularly the military, to do what they need to do to destroy Khamenei's proxies when that scenario is now under an Islamic Republic nuclear umbrella and under nuclear threats.
I wanted to add to just one thing. Of course, I will not comment on. You had a very lively discussion about Israel has and has not, and I cannot be part of that discussion. I do want to say something more general about deterrence, which I've been thinking a lot more and more. We say Israel's fundamental principles of our national security strategy, as David Ben-Gurion put them back in the days of conception of Israel, that our strategy is based on our ability to deter our enemies, to detect by intelligence when they plan something, to decisively win, preferably in their territory, and later on we added defense as another principle to our national security unwritten strategy. All those four have clearly failed in October 7th. One must ask, how can you deter an enemy who is more willing to kill you than to protect their own people? Going back to Iran being both genocidal and suicidal, which I think they are. As Mark rightly said, we shouldn't think otherwise, or at least always be aware of the option that they be willing to act. How do you deter such an enemy? Well, I don't think you can deter such an enemy. I will say that in general, if we look at the scope of things and ask, where does deterrence actually work in the world today? Was the North Atlantic Treaty strong enough to deter Putin from invading Ukraine? So you can say, okay, Ukraine is not part of NATO. All right. But there's a huge conflict in Europe that has been waging for 2 years. Nobody has any idea how this is going to end and when. Who's deterring who at this point? I'm not asking the questions about Southeast Asia. I don't know enough about the topic, but I think we all need to think about what does deterrence mean in the 21st century in this capacity. Are strategic capabilities capable of deterring conventional conflict like they did most of the years of Cold War? No, they don't. They don't anymore. And the ability of non-state actors to act, the usage of proxies in such a wide way like the Iranians are doing, and not only the Iranians are using proxies, this has completely changed the way that we need to think about national strategically and global order at this point in time. I'm not sure that the term deterrence is still valid the way we're used to think about it in the good days of the the very good days of the Cold War.
I would argue that we don't want to confuse two separate concepts. One is the concept of mutually assured destruction, which worked with the Soviet Union because the Russians after World War II, they understood how bad a war would be. They were evil. I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, but they were not crazy. They were not irrational about these things. That, I would say, is separate from what I think deterrence should mean. Deterrence should mean that your enemies understand this will not be a fair fight. You will be crushed so decisively that you really don't want to do this. But if you want to have that kind of deterrence, your military capabilities have to be not on a par with those of your enemies or any combination of your enemies. They have to be hugely superior. That means you must not do what the U.S. is doing right now, reducing defense spending, shrinking your military. By the way, the Israelis also thought, we got all this high-tech stuff. We can shrink our military. We don't need so many soldiers. We don't need so many soldiers in the Gaza envelope. We don't need to worry about the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, if they don't want us to be part of be drafted. That's okay. There's a big controversy now in Israel. I'm aware of this. So in other words, if you're talking about deterrence, you're not talking about mutually assured destruction. You're talking about you are the primary power, and everybody knows you don't take a punch, you don't take a swing at this guy because you'll end up on the floor bleeding.
When you're Israel, only the latter matters, right? Deterrence in the old-fashioned way that your adversaries or your enemies is wary of opening a war because they know that they will be defeated. This is the kind of deterrence I'm talking about. I'm a student of Graham Allison, so I read his book. I'm not sure that mutually assured destruction was as strong as people think. The Cuban Missile Crisis may have provided evidence that there were at least one Soviet premier that was thinking that he might sneak something out of it. But that's long gone, and I'm very happy that we didn't go into a nuclear third world war in the 60s in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that is a reality from a different time, from a different world, and a different enemy. I'm not talking about American enemies. I'm talking about Israel enemies. We are not facing. This is not a two global power bipolar conflict like the U.S. and Soviet Union back in the 50s and the 60s. We are surrounded by proxies of an enemy called Iran that is using asymmetric warfare against us, not even conventional warfare against us. The whole terminology of military conflict and strategy, and specifically deterrence, I'm not sure that they're valid at this point the way they were before.
All right, one bonus question, just because I'm interested. The idea of building a pier off the shore of Gaza to bring in a supply. The Israelis are not necessarily. Is this a good idea or a stupid idea? That's what I want to know.
I'll tell you my position on it, and I think you guys definitely know. Maybe some of the audience know. I've been advocating from day one that Israel needs to do way more on the humanitarian side, because ultimately this is what's gonna determine the amount of legitimacy that we're getting. And I must say, the fact that we achieve more than 5 months of such legitimacy and such backing by President Biden, this must be said very clearly from an Israeli perspective. What President Biden did for Israel during this war is unprecedented. I'm not sure there's going to be another president who will do this. Way longer than I anticipated when the war started. Having said all of that, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is becoming stronger. The footage that is coming out of the Gaza, I'm not talking just about the number of casualties, which is a bizarre argument that is completely skewed by data that isn't verified. But the level of hunger is increasing. That is a fact.
But isn't the problem distribution rather than delivery?
So, if and again, I will dare say that I do have criticism for I think Israel should have been way more active way before in both supplying more and through our control, so it will be verified, and also take care of the distribution. For that, we need a system, a civilian system in Gaza that we can hand over the humanitarian goods to, so it doesn't get raided the way it did by Hamas supporters, leading to this unfortunate catastrophe a few weeks ago when dozens and dozens were crammed and crushed by trucks. I don't think the issue is the pier. And I understand the need of the administration to elevate some of the criticism or the pressure that they are mounting. This isn't the issue. At the end of the day, what I hope our government will start to do, because, by the way, 2 days ago they did. We started allowing trucks to go through the northern crossings of Gaza, which Israel controls, where we're able to verify and to monitor what's getting in, hopefully to do more with the distribution of it. We will need to do this. We cannot allow a humanitarian catastrophe to be just under our hands while our soldiers are on the ground. This is not who we are. This isn't what we should be.
Though it's unique, I cannot think of another situation where a nation at war has to provide for those on the other side who are fighting them and can't even distinguish between the civilians and the soldiers, and where human shields are the strategy of Hamas. We're not going to go on. Any last thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge win for Khamenei, because what are we all focused on right now? Right. No, I mean, let's make it very clear. And it's not just about the weapon of mass destruction. It's that we're now focused on this humanitarian crisis in Gaza that his proxy caused by invading Israel. Right? Who, as you said, Cliff, has a strategy of using civilians as human shields. Hamas wants to maximize the number of civilians who are killed, right, and maimed and are without food. And he is not getting held accountable.
No.
They're not blaming Khamenei or the Islamic Republic.
No.
Not even blaming Hamas.
Right.
They're blaming the Israelis.
Right. Or other Qataris who host Hamas leaders.
So if you're Khamenei, you've had a good 5 months, because, as Eyal said, this entire proxy strategy, using Hamas, creating a weapon of mass destruction, has essentially undermined Israel's standing in the world. And I'm much more critical of President Biden than Eyal is. Right? I mean, I think standing by Israel for the first few weeks or even a couple of months after the horrors of October 7th, any president would have done so. You know, when you test the mettle of a president is when the going gets tough. And Israel has had to go into the most complicated urban environment, right? I mean, this is not me saying this. Is John Spencer, who's the head of the Urban Warfare Institute at West Point, saying this, right? Who's also a former combat soldier. The most complicated urban environment probably in history, and has had to deal with unbelievable scrutiny. I mean, can you imagine, Cliff, if we land in Normandy, D-Day, the Allied troops fight their way, right, through France and Belgium and Luxembourg and into Germany. There's 24/7 news coverage of every battle against the Nazis. Okay? Unbelievable condemnations coming out of the Western press, right, about how Allied forces are causing massive civilian casualties as they fight the Nazis. And they get into Germany, and they get on the outskirts of Berlin, and there's still Nazi battalions in Berlin, okay? And someone from the outside, in that case, we were the United States, we had the power, but someone from the outside said, stop. The fighting has to end. This humanitarian crisis that is now spreading into Berlin is too much. And I order Allied forces right now, Supreme Allied Commander, to end all fighting right now
and
before we move into Berlin. And bring in supplies. Let Hitler survive.
Yeah.
Let the Nazi command survive. And let significant battalions of Nazi troops survive. Well, that scenario is happening right now to Israel, in Gaza, in Rafah. And this time it's a U.S. president, Joe Biden, who is saying, stop. Stop before you've defeated Hamas. Stop before you've destroyed the 4 remaining battalions that can reconstitute themselves into a significant fighting force. Stop before you've destroyed the tunnels, as you say, Cliff, that resupply Hamas from Egypt into Gaza. Stop, because this humanitarian crisis has gotten out of control. And I'm going to now impose a red line. Joe Biden finally imposes a red line for the first time in his presidency. Not against China, not against North Korea, not against Iran. he imposes this red line
He's pulled back a little
on
bit
Israel.
On that, but yes.
Well,
yeah, okay.
Well,
Yeah, all right,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
right now we're in election season.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
Joe Biden wants to appeal to the extreme left and pull them in and ensure they show up at the polls, and wants to ensure that he doesn't lose independents and centrists by becoming too hard on Israel.
Right.
But he's imposed a red line on our most important ally in the Middle East that's fighting for its life against Khamenei and the Islamic Republic and the Iran-backed Axis. And for that, I think he deserves criticism.
All right, we've gone long, but I think it's worth it. It's been an enlightening discussion. Not a cheery discussion, I would say. But thanks, Eyal. Thanks, Marks. Thanks to all of you who have stayed with us for this discussion here today on Foreign Policy.